This is Doctor Talks, real talk from real doctors on the issues that matter to you most. All right, we're continuing with the Sleep Deep Summit, looking at new ways to treat insomnia and sleep apnea. I'm your host, Dr. Audrey Wells, and I am really excited to talk to our next speaker for some personal reasons. So Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith is a board-certified internal medicine doctor, a speaker, an award-winning author, and I first discovered her through her TED Talk. I remember it was in 2019 on March 28th. It had just come out. I remember that day because it was my birthday and I was looking for a way to be better at rest. So Dr. Dalton-Smith, it's a pleasure to see you. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So I want to dive right in because I've known about you for a while and your work has satisfied a professional need for me. Can I tell you about that?
Please do.
Yeah. So a lot of times when I help people fix their sleep, they are still tired. They report fatigue. They report feeling like they're not able to have the energy that they want through the day. And it's quite frustrating because for all intents and purposes, their sleep looks cured. When I discovered your work about rest, it was helpful to be able to understand how to talk to people about that. But it was also helpful for me personally because I am very good at sleep, but I am not so good at rest. Do you ever see this for the people that you work with?
All the time. It's very common.
Yeah. And it's kind of a paradox, right? I think people usually associate being tired with sleep, but I can tell you my sleep is very good. And I took your rest quiz online back in 2019, and I've just taken it again today in preparation for this interview. So I want to go over some of the components of that quiz. And I have to start out by saying you got me with the first question, which was if I could spend an extra hour finishing my to-do list or sleep, I choose sleep. For me, it's to-do list every single time. What is this question meant to capture? What sort of rest deficiency does it name?
Yeah, it begins by really evaluating, do you have any respect for rest? I think that's where I have to start with most people. What's your mindset around rest? I think a lot of us automatically think rest is related to cessation activities. It's simply about stopping. And so the first question is just to begin to get people to start looking at their view of rest. And in doing so, it helps me to see how likely and prone are you to be in some type of rest deficit. Because if you're fighting rest, if you think it's only about stopping and not about restoration, if you have this kind of mindset that rest is lesser than, that it's taking something away from you, and you're pushing more towards that to-do list rather than taking a moment to reprieve and whatever that may look like, all 7 of the types of rest can become a deficit in that case.
You know, I didn't score normally on any of the 7 rest deficits. So before we dive into some of these results, I wonder if you can list the different types of rest deficits that you've described and maybe a few words about what that means.
Yeah. So the 7 types of rest include physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, social, sensory, and creative. And I'm oftentimes asked, can you fail the assessment? No, it's an assessment. It gives you an idea of where you're at in each area. And most of us won't have like static scores. They won't be exactly the same every time you take them, because each time you take the assessment, you're going through different things in your life. Your day was different, how you used energy. And that's really what it's boiling down to, is just evaluating, are the places in your life where you're expending energy, are you doing restorative things to pour back into those areas? Because if you don't, then they're prone to become deficient. And so physically, that divides up into both active and passive. So passive being sleeping and napping. And then the active components of physical rest include things like stretching and yoga and using a foam roller and massage therapy, all of those things that help with circulation, lymphatics, everything down to like body ergonomics, how you use your office space. Mental rest looks at your cerebral space. How clear is it? Are you able to concentrate, focus? Is your memory still good? If your mind's very busy and you can't kind of get it to a quiet place, it can be hard to concentrate and have clarity. Spiritual rest has a lot to do with purpose and belonging and that sense that your life has meaning. Emotional rest looks at exactly that, emotions and how you're processing them. Your emotional resilience plays a part in that as well as your coping mechanisms with emotions. Social rest looks at your relationships and how they are either draining you or pouring back into you. Because a lot of times relationships can become very one-sided. So even ones that can do both, that can pull from you and pour into you, if we're not careful, they can become very one-sided and you might find yourself being more depleted in certain relationships versus others. And then sensory and creative were two that a lot of people have never heard of, thought about. Sensory has to deal with our sensory inputs, everything from the gadgets we use to the light, sound, smells in our atmosphere, and the effect they have on us, the effect they have on our brain, the processing of them, whether conscious or subconscious, and the draining effect that those can have. And then creative looks at how we process information, specifically problem solving and the creative processes within our mind and our spirit. And then what are the things we do to awaken creativity? What are the things we do that inspire awe and wonder in our lives?
That's a fantastic encapsulation of the 7 types of rest. And I also want to underscore 2 points that I think are really helpful for the audience to focus on. One is that this use of energy is what you're describing as depleting the 7 different types of rest. And the depletion does not get resolved with inaction, it sounds like. You need to do something to restore that particular type of category.
In many cases, I look at it oftentimes like this. My background is in internal medicine. I've been in clinical practice for over 20 years. And, if somebody walks into my emergency room and they're bleeding, and I tell my nurse, suture them up and send them on their way, that could be sufficient in most cases. But if that person was on a blood thinner or if they've been bleeding for 12 hours, I could have her suture them up and send them out still anemic. So they're going to be drained, depleted, and exhausted when I send them out that door, although I've actually stopped the bleeding. That's what we do on the weekends a lot of times when we Netflix and chill. We suture it up, but we've been so depleted over the course of our week that now we are leaving in an anemic energy state. And we wonder, why am I so tired on Monday? I laid around all day. Well, you didn't do anything to pour back into the places, in many cases, that the deficit existed.
That's really helpful. And I like that analogy of you got to stop the bleeding first, but also look at underlying causes, make sure that you're not missing anything that could be sort of eroding your energy level. And the weekend patch, oh my gosh, I think so many people are doing catch up on the weekend just to keep their head above water. And when I got the vocabulary that you give in these 7 types of rest, it became a lot easier to see where not only I was deficient, but people that I was trying to help were deficient. So I want to tell you my top 3 areas of depletion. So mental depletion was number 1, physical depletion was number 2, and sensory number 3. I will say that mental depletion is easy for me to describe. I'm constantly creating as an entrepreneur. I'm putting out a lot of information. Physically, I carry stress in my body, particularly shoulders. And from a sensory perspective, I think I've got 2 little boys. They are like Tasmanian devils. And a lot of what you talk about with sensory depletion goes with, interaction with young children. So I wonder if you can comment on these types of rest specifically. How do I get help?
Yeah. Well, I love how you describe sensory with young kids, because oftentimes you're right. It's the background noises that have become a part of our lives that oftentimes you can't just get rid of. I mean, you can't just get rid of your kids because they're being kids. They're being noisy and playing games and all the things. And so it's looking at what are some ways we can downgrade our sensory input. You can't get rid of the kids. If you work in construction, you can't get rid of machines. That's part of your job. So you then start looking at what are ways we can downgrade sensory input. Do we turn off the radio or TV or whatever it is when we're in the home and no one's watching it? On your commute back and forth from work, rather than listening to something, which is what a lot of us do, you might benefit yourself more by driving home in silence, because that's actually what you're needing. You're needing a sensory reprieve. Having moments in your day where you maybe put on some noise cancellation earphones, not because you want to listen to something, but because you don't want to hear something. You want to block out the noise for a short period of time. And then honestly, with sensory, a big thing that we've noticed for a lot of people is downgrading the notifications on your phone. A lot of us get excessive amounts of notifications from everything from the weather to the news to social media and everything in between. And many of those notifications are not things that are urgent. They're not something we actually must see at that exact moment. So you can keep all of the apps on all of your devices, but actually take back a little bit of your own personal health control and go into those apps when you actually want to learn or hear that information, rather than just giving them permission to push you little doses of stress and endorphins and, and cortisol whenever it feels like it. As far as the mental rest part of it, if you happen to be someone who is I call it a chronic thinker. You think about the things you're thinking about. You're
Definitely.
always
Definitely.
information, yeah. And some of us are just kind of hot wired to be information hungry. We like to learn. And people who like learning and like information have a tendency to be processors. And processors in their mind works very similar to a computer. It keeps processing until something turns it off. And so I find for a lot of people with a mental rest deficit, they have to find some way to adapt mindfulness or meditation type practices in their life. Now, when I say those words, I can already feel eyes like, oh, she said meditation. I don't meditate. But I think we need to kind of start looking at it a little bit more holistic and not just kind of boxing it into whatever your either religion or those practice beliefs look like. Because I know for a lot of the people that I work with, they actually get mindfulness type experiences and meditative practices when they are physically using their body. So for example, if you're someone who finds that you go jogging, well, jogging is not restful in itself, the actual physical activity of jogging, you're using your physical body. But for some people, the excessive physical use of their body helps their brain to shut up. And so while they're jogging, they're actually thinking specifically about their breathing and their cadence, which then focus the mind down to something so minute that it's actually at the similar process in the brain as meditation. And so heavy weightlifting, jogging, as I mentioned, knitting, stitching, things that can put you in kind of almost like robotic mode can act like a meditative practice. And for someone who, especially if you sit all day, your body may not be tired. So the jogging part doesn't bother you because your body is not the issue. It's your brain that has to be able to quiet down. So I think we have to look at some of those kind of what is rest and what isn't, divide them up so that you're not thinking that rest is just standing still, laying down, all of those things. It's really getting specific about the parts of you that need that restoration.
This is all gold. I can't even tell you how much I counsel people who have monkey mind at night. Their thoughts are bouncing around, they're ruminating. Oftentimes it's associated with worry, anxiety. Mm-hmm. And it turns out they don't have any white space during their day to kind of make a to-do list or strategize about the weekend. And so at night, when it's dark and quiet and calm, the brain comes out to kind of bloom and play. And what you're describing, especially with the jogging, I love that, because that evacuation of energy, that physical energy, helps soothe the mind too.
So true. And I love what you shared about, that nighttime pattern so many of us get caught up in, where you lay down and it's like, oh, now all of a sudden my brain wants to wake up and be creative and be all of these things. One of the things I find that helps a lot of people is just when they get caught in that rumination process, to start practicing brain dumping, having a notepad. I try to keep people from getting locked up into, oh, I've heard this before. I don't journal. I'm not saying journal. It could literally be on a Post-it note or, just some little piece of paper where you jot down whatever the thought is. But there's something about that practice of jotting it down. It's almost as if it gives the brain permission to release it. It's like the brain now says, it is no longer my responsibility to keep up with that little tidbit of information. I can relax now. And I think a lot of us need to get into that practice, because whenever you start ruminating on a thought, it's like your mind will hold on to that thought, even at the expense of you going to sleep.
It's so true. And we're not really operating with the best part of our brains when the night starts and if we wake up during the night. So that rumination tendency tends to be stronger. And I kind of liken it to doing a purge of your closet. You got to take everything out, put the clothes on the bed, and then it gives you some distance. What am I going to keep? What do I want to throw out? And, sometimes middle of the night thinking can be it's just not believable, the stuff that your mind comes up with. So it gives you a chance to kind of evaluate, is that really true? No. So I'm going to stop thinking it. I love that. And it's a really tangible way that people who wake up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep can sort of aid that process once they're aware it's happening.
One of the things I find a lot with clients I coach and people that I work with is a lot of times it is the to-do list, and it's these kind of creative thoughts that come up. I find a lot of times, as you mentioned, worrying, I find it often that when someone has like a conversation, maybe that they had at work, that they're repeating, or I say replaying in their head, and it's like they're going through the different scenarios of what they wish they'd said and how it affected them and all these other things. I'm often asked, do I write down the conversation? And that's actually usually not the problem. The problem is something about that interaction usually has awakened something emotionally inside of you. And we're talking about mental rest, but because the brain functions both mentally and emotionally, sometimes that rumination is part of the emotional rest trying to work itself out in the middle of the night. So rather than jotting down the conversation, which actually doesn't help, I always have people evaluate this question: what did that interaction make you feel? Because if it made you feel something negative, made you feel less than, made you feel incompetent, made you feel disrespected, especially if it's something at work or with a spouse, write down what it made you feel. Don't try to process it right then. Just write it down so that the emotion has been given the validity of existing in a space. And then the next morning, because once you release it, you're going to feel more comfortable. It's like, okay, I recognize what that is. Go to sleep, wake up the next morning, and then process through why you felt that way.
I couldn't agree with you more. And oftentimes I say sleep is an emotional experience. You enter sleep through an emotion that's generally neutral, maybe slightly positive, and low amplitude. And if you can't sleep, oftentimes the feelings are not safe, not enough, or not congruent with our values. So I love that. It's a really great way to get some perspective on what's going on for you in the middle of the night, and then follow up the next day with processing. And I'm wondering, what does that look like? What does emotional processing look like for you?
Yeah. So, with emotional rest, I think too often we get fearful that we're going to trauma dump. And so we don't do emotional rest. Emotional rest really is just having the freedom to be authentic about what you're feeling, being able to share those emotions without having to clean them up so that they're easier for somebody else to understand or digest, just saying something as it is. However, when we start being concerned about trauma dumping, we oftentimes what the issue is we don't want to bring another person into our pain. But emotional rest doesn't really do that. When you're sharing about what an event did to you, how it made you feel, what emotions it awoke in you, you're not taking someone through all of the details of the event. When I sit down with someone and they're telling me their story, and they're not telling me about what they experienced, they're actually painting a picture like we're going into a movie. And when that happens, that's when we're trauma dumping, because you're basically trying to, it's like a writer writing a fiction novel, or a screen editor writing a play. You want the person who is experiencing to feel the emotions. That is not what we want. We want them to understand what the experience did to us. And it's a much more vulnerable situation to say, that relationship made me feel used, than to say, this is what he did to me. It's easier for me to tell you what he did to me and give you all the gore and the details of the relationship, rather than saying, this is what it made me feel personally. So I think we have to make sure that when we're doing emotional rest, we're talking about our own feelings. We're talking about what our vulnerable moments were in that interaction. And we're making space to heal, whether that be in the conversation with a person, friend, a therapist, a coach, whoever you feel is a safe place to share those emotions. However, some people experience emotional rest through expression artistically. Now, this gets confused with creative rest, but creative rest is actually not the productivity, or the production rather, of a creative element. It's the appreciation of it. So there's no work involved with creative rest. It's just the appreciation. However, for some people, playing music, drawing art, acting theater, acting out within theater, all of those can be expressions of how they share their emotions. I'm a writer, and part of my writing is more scientific and clinical and all of that. And part of my writing is poetry, because it's how I process pain. And so when I'm writing and I'm processing pain and whatever else is going on in my life, those types of negative emotions, I tend to express them through an artistic expression. And so nobody in the world ever will see those, because they're kind of just my way of releasing that.
That's so interesting. And I think I see what you're saying. Your creative expression is emotional rest.
As a release.
Yes. But the creativity expressed could actually necessitate restoration for creativity. So then you would go into nature or appreciate art that's already done by somebody else.
That's exactly right. So one of the ways that I get emotional rest is I write poetry. And in writing the poetry, I can share the hard emotions of being a physician in the middle of COVID and the things you see and the things you wish you never saw, those kind of things. So I can express that without bringing anybody else into the trauma of it with me. So I can get healing that I need without harming anyone else. However, when I need creative rest, just as you stated, for me, it's water. Over 60% of the population experience creative rest around bodies of water when they experience through nature. So I go and I do a walk around the lake in my area. And so as I'm walking around the lake, I'm appreciating the beauty of nature. And that it opens up something inside of me creatively that fills me back up. It brings me back to a place of feeling restored and energized and refreshed.
That's what so many people are looking for, feeling restored and energized and refreshed. And what you're describing takes a fair amount of self-awareness. And I think that self-awareness can also be augmented with practices like meditation, however that looks, and practices like journaling, however that looks. But one of the things I commonly deal with is hypnotism by an electronic screen at night, where self-awareness is quite low because a person is just scrolling and looking for another dopamine hit, or gets emotionally engaged in something that is not related to their own life at all. Talk to me about screens.
Yeah, I call that the nightly escape. I think a lot of us practice escapism as our form of rest. We don't know how to rest. We don't have the details oftentimes of even understanding what type of rest we need. And so we try to rest simply by sleeping 8 hours. And then we wake up the next morning still exhausted. And then rest feels like it doesn't work for you, because what you did was sleep. You didn't actually rest. They're not the same thing. And so I think that escapism then becomes the way that we zone out, so to speak, and shut our brain down long enough just for it to get some type of reprieve, because we think that that's at least I'm not thinking about my own stuff while I'm thinking about, whoever I'm watching on TV. I think for a lot of us, we have to get very real about, are we watching TV or movies because it's a creative rest element? It's something that actually feeds our creativity and inspires us and motivates us, and we leave it feeling better than when we entered in. Or if we're spending time kind of glued to our screens as a way of ignoring the disconnect that we feel with the world around us and with our life. It's a hard question to ask, and it's what I have to ask myself. I oftentimes tell people I didn't write my book, Sacred Rest, because I was just like, oh, this is a great idea. I burned out. I burned out in a profession I love. And I knew if I was going to stay in healthcare in any capacity, that I had to figure out a way that rest and restoration was sustainable. It wasn't going to be boiled down to a weekend, here and there. It wasn't going to be just whenever I could get a vacation twice a year. It had to be something that I could incorporate into the middle of a busy and active life. And I think that's where many of us have to get to a place of recognizing that self-discovery, although difficult, once you start recognizing how you restore, you don't have to keep discovering that over and over again. You then get to transition to being more intentional about, now, how do I make this habitual? How do I incorporate this into my real life? The life I currently have, not quitting all my jobs or, whatever, just this current life. How do I bring in some restorative elements to help myself stay in a place of being well?
That's so important to underscore. And this is sort of an in-depth conversation about looking at oneself and taking responsibility for what you're doing or not doing in your life. I think it's interesting when you talk about social media and engaging with that at bedtime or even in the middle of the night, because in a way it's a social depletion, but I think it can ding other things as well, like your mental energy or your emotional rest. And with social media, and maybe even especially since the pandemic, there's been kind of this distancing that comes with people, even people in your own family. People are farther apart or they lost connections. So one thing I want to be sure and talk about is this concept of how emotional rest and social rest are related when we're talking about interacting with a real life person versus a person who's online or virtual.
Yeah, that's such a great question, because with everything that's gone on over the past few years, there's been a huge shift to a lot of things being done virtual. And there's this mindset that virtual is just as good as in person. And there's a lot of things you can do virtually that are similar to being in person, but not exactly the same. There's a power of just being in the presence of someone. There's some things that you can see when we're face to face, so to speak, with someone in person that you can't necessarily see behind the screen. Over the past couple of years, we've had over, I think, over a quarter of a million people now who've taken the assessment at restquiz.com to evaluate their personal rest deficits. And so we're able to kind of see how these scores in different areas correlate. And whenever there's a rise in an emotional rest deficit, there tends to be a rise in social rest deficits at the same time, because they do both require people. With emotional rest, most of us aren't using art to express our emotions. We are expressing it with people. And so then you have to determine who are the people in your life who don't need anything from you. Because if you're going to someone and you're trying to receive something and they're pulling on you, it's a no-win situation. Unfortunately, most of us, the majority of people in our lives, are those people who are needing things from us. They're negatively pulling from our social energy. And so we limit oftentimes the people who are life-giving, the ones who are actually pouring back into us, because since they are not demanding on our time, we don't feel the pull to actually create space for them. We make space for the people who are more demanding, and those demanding people are the ones who are usually draining us. Now, when you add in social media on top of that, it's not just the people in your immediate vicinity. Now you have people who actually can reach you from thousands of miles away, and they're also pulling on your energy, because the nature of social media is not giving. It's not a generous atmosphere. It's more of a what's in it for me atmosphere. And so it's a negative pull socially on most of us continuously.
Totally agree. I mean, you're giving up your attention. You're giving your even just likes or hearts or whatever. You're depleting yourself when you interact that way to people who you'll never meet, people who don't ever even necessarily represent themselves authentically online. And so I think that contributes to the depletion. You know, I think that when you look at rest, it makes so much sense to kind of deliberately go through and ask yourself, what am I missing and how can I replenish that? In your book, I would wonder, is that sort of described with examples given? Because sometimes I have a hard time coming up with ways to replenish the things that I need.
Yeah, in the book Sacred Rest, Recover Your Life, Renew Your Energy, Restore Your Sanity, what we ended up doing, we went through all 7 types of rest. We actually divided the book up into 2 sections. The first half of the book talks about the 7 types of rest, why we're not resting, all of those kind of things. The second half talks about what I call the gifts of rest, which are more of a spiritual kind of approach to, now that you know the science behind it, let's look at some of the other components of it. But in that first half of the book, we talk about the rest method, which is first R, recognizing your current rest, E, evaluating your situation so that you're evaluating what's led to this deficit. S is the science and the research, so you actually understand what it is you're trying to fix. And then T is today's application. So we gave examples of how to get rest in each of those areas so that people could have, some ideas of where to begin. But the thing is, these examples and the ways you can restore are as individualized and as vast as there are people and personalities. And so I always recommend that people, try some of the ones we recommend, but then look at it and see what works for you. What are variations of that would fit your beliefs, that fits your lifestyle, that fits your climate? Because whether you live in a rural setting or in the middle of, downtown New York or Chicago, it's going to be different how you experience some of these things. And so all of that has to come into play. I'm a realist. When I sit down with the patient and I'm talking to them about, diabetes or high blood pressure, if they tell me, well, this is my lifestyle, I don't tell them, oh, go get a new life. That's just not realistic. We have to start where you're at, come up with some strategies for right where you're at now as you're making changes to improve in these different areas.
That makes sense. And it occurs to me that the next time I'm awake in the middle of the night, thinking about how I could get better rest would be a great activity to soothe my brain. You mentioned 250 million people have taken this test. I'm curious to know if there's any differences in women versus men, especially as I think of the invisible burden that many women have, especially if they work and have children, trying to manage everything with some semblance of balance. What are the results of these 250 million surveys?
Yeah, it's been really crazy. We have some studies now that are in different countries. Some I can talk about, some I can't, that are in the process of being released as it relates to women in certain countries and their leave and how that looks as far as rest. And some of the things that we're finding is it is very different. It differs based on cultures, based on beliefs within cultures about what rest looks like, and really, I don't want to say the value of rest, but I don't know another way of terming that. In some cultures, rest is just not seen as valuable. Work is what's valuable. Rest is like the evil cousin that you deal with if you have to, but it's not something that actually is seen as helping productivity. And so it's a matter of actually having to change the cultural belief even around what rest and leave and restorative practices and all of these things mean. One of the things we're noticing is that there are certain companies in the US as well as certain countries where there is an importance placed upon restorative practices. And we see increased innovation, we see decreased illness, and we see decreased employee turnover, we see improved employee morale, and you see all of these positive changes that occur. But still, the culture oftentimes thinks, well, if I train my employees to do restorative practices, that the work is going to decrease and productivity is going to go down. Wherever everything in literature and research actually shows the exact opposite of that, because people are resources, just like anything else. And just as you would have to charge up your Apple Watch at the end of the day, or it's going to just die on you, it's the very same thing with human life. If we don't have recharge moments throughout our day, week, year, if we don't have those set in place, people die. They die with their passions die, their motivations die, their energy die, their relationships die, their health. All of these things can be depleted. And we have to recognize that there are ways that we can maintain it without it costing us anything other than intentionality.
Oh my gosh, I love all of that. And kind of the equivalent with sleep is the idea that I'll sleep when I'm dead, or
I love that one.
Yeah.
That's pretty late to decide to sleep, but
totally. And it makes no sense. You're gonna die earlier if that's the attitude that you adopt. Oh my gosh, this has been a fantastic conversation. And I know that there's people out there who would want to learn more about you and read your book and take the rest quiz. Can you explain how people work with you and where they should go to find you?
Yes, the rest quiz is simple enough. You can it's a free assessment at simplyrestquiz.com. And my main website is at drdaltonsmith.com, just drdaltonsmith.com. And the way that we work with people, we tend to work with corporations for the most part. A lot of companies hire us to either do trainings or consulting as it relates to their workplace wellness initiatives. I find that most of the time the issue is that we have to bridge that gap between rest and productivity so that, first of all, the leaders understand that there is a healthy connection between the two, and that we can then translate that over into their teams so that we're able to build people back up and create well-being cultures within the country.
That sounds like good common sense to me.
Absolutely.
Listen, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks so much for contributing to this conversation. As a tangent to sleep, you need to take care of your rest. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Doctor Talks. We hope today's episode has enlightened and inspired you on your path to optimal health. Each day is a new opportunity to make choices that empower your well-being. For more insights and strategies, subscribe to our podcast and visit our website, www.drtalks.com. Stay connected, stay healthy, and join us next time on Doctor Talks. Real talks from real doctors on the issues that matter to you most.